Welcome to this deep dive into the world of penetration testing. You've given us a really interesting mix of sources here. Excerpts from a book about hacking, some specific instructions for setting up a virtual lab, and even a sneak peek at the index. So it seems like you're ready to get your hands dirty with some ethical hacking.
It definitely looks like you want to understand not just the theory, but the practical setup and tools used in penetration testing.
Yeah.
We can definitely help you unpack that.
Okay, let's start with the basics.
Okay.
The book mentions several phases of a pen test: pre-engagement, information gathering, threat modeling, vulnerability analysis, exploitation, post-exploitation, and reporting.
Right.
Sounds pretty intense.
It's a structured approach to simulate real-world attacks and uncover vulnerabilities before the bad guys do. What's fascinating here is the emphasis on understanding the client's business goals.
Uh-huh.
It's not just about finding any vulnerability. It's about understanding which ones pose the biggest risk to the organization.
And speaking of getting practical, the source material walks us through setting up a virtual lab. It even recommends using a specific version of Kali Linux, 1.0.6, which seems important if you want to follow along exactly. It also mentions being careful about connecting vulnerable target machines to your local network safety first.
Right. It is, and there's a good reason for that. Kali Linux comes preloaded with a ton of security tools, but using a specific version ensures you can follow along exactly with the examples and exercises in your sources. Think of it as having all the right ingredients for your hacking recipes.
Speaking of recipes, the source material is pretty detailed about setting up vulnerable target machines too.
Yeah.
Windows XP, Ubuntu 8.10, Windows 7, even specific outdated software versions like Zerbit.4, War FTP 1.65, and Adobe Acrobat Reader 8.1.2.
Right.
Why is it so important to use these outdated versions?
Great question. Working with these older, vulnerable systems gives you a controlled environment to understand how classic exploits work.
Yeah.
It's like learning the fundamentals of martial arts before sparring with a black belt. Plus, you'd be surprised how much outdated software is still running out there in the real world.
Oh, yeah.
Legacy systems can be a goldmine for attackers.
Okay, lab setup, safety precautions in place.
Right.
Time to unleash our inner hacker.
Not so fast. Before we break anything, we need to gather intel.
Okay.
Think of it like a detective case. The more we know about our target, the better our chances of finding and exploiting weaknesses.
The book calls this open source intelligence gathering, or OSINT.
Right.
So basically, becoming internet sleuths.
Precisely. It's amazing what you can uncover with some clever Googling. The source material mentions looking for job postings.
Yeah.
If a company needs a Drupal expert, chances are they're running Drupal on their servers. It's like a digital fingerprint they may not even realize they're leaving behind.
So a little digital stalking for the greater good.
Exactly. And there are more technical tools for this reconnaissance phase, like NIST lookup and host, which are used for DNS reconnaissance.
DNS reconnaissance.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty intense.
It's basically digging into a target's domain name system. Think of it like a digital phone book. With NIST lookup, you can find the IP address associated with a domain, or even discover their mail servers. It can tell you if they're using a service like Gmail or running their own email setup.
So we've scoured the internet, found some digital breadcrumbs.
Yeah.
What's next in our hacking toolkit?
Port scanning. This is where we map the attack surface, basically, figuring out which services are running on a target system and which ports they're listening on. Think of it as digitally knocking on doors to see who answers.
And there are different ways to do this, right? The book mentions using Netcat, which seems pretty manual.
Right.
And then there's this automated tool called Nmap.
You got it. Netcat is like sending a simple hello to a specific port.
Uh-huh.
If a service is listening, it will respond, often with a banner revealing information about its type and version.
Okay.
Nmap, on the other hand, is a powerhouse. It can scan a range of ports quickly, identifying the operating system, software versions, and even potential vulnerabilities based on the services it finds.
So Nmap is like a super-powered port scanner.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting. Nmap has a scripting engine, which opens up a world of possibilities for reconnaissance and vulnerability analysis. It's like having a toolbox full of specialized gadgets for different hacking scenarios.
Okay, so we've gathered information, mapped our attack surface.
Right.
Are we finally ready for the actual exploiting of vulnerabilities?
You bet. And the source material has a buffet of exploits to choose from. Some are classic vulnerabilities like EMA08067, a weakness in the SMB server that allows remote code execution.
Okay.
It's like finding a secret backdoor into a system. Then there are more modern attacks aimed at web applications, like SQL injection and cross-site scripting.
Hold on, let's break that down.
Okay.
What exactly is MS-08067, and why is it such a big deal?
It's a famous vulnerability that affected older versions of Windows, like Windows XP. Imagine an attacker sending specially crafted packets to an unpatched SMB server. Those packets can trigger a chain reaction that gives them complete control over the system. They can steal data, install malware, even take over the entire machine.
So if you find a system running an older Windows version without this patch,
Yeah,
it's basically game over.
pretty much. And the source material shows how to exploit this using Metasploit, a powerful framework for penetration testing. Think of Metasploit as the ultimate hacking toolkit. It has modules for a wide range of exploits, making it relatively easy to leverage vulnerabilities like MS-08067. It even lets you create your own custom exploits, but that's a deep dive for another day.
Okay, so we've used Metasploit to exploit this vulnerability we're in.
Yeah.
What happens next?
Now we move into post-exploitation. The source material mentions a payload called Meterpreter, which gives you much more control than a regular command shell. We're talking stealing passwords, uploading and downloading files, even using the compromise system to attack other machines on the network.
Wait, using one compromise system to attack others? That sounds like a nightmare scenario for a company.
It is. It's called lateral movement, and it's how attackers can really wreak havoc. They gain a foothold in one system, then use it to hop from machine to machine, spreading their control like a digital virus.
And the source material actually walks us through some techniques for lateral movement.
It does. It covers techniques like PSSEC, token impersonation, and SSEC, PCSEC, for example, is a tool that lets you run commands on remote Windows systems. It's often used by administrators for legitimate purposes, but in the wrong hands, it becomes a powerful tool for lateral movement.
So if an attacker compromises a machine with admin rights, they can use PSEC to control other Windows systems on the network.
Exactly. Then there's token impersonation, which is like stealing someone's ID badge to gain access to restricted areas. In Windows, every user session has a security token with their identity and privileges. An attacker can steal that token and essentially become that user, potentially accessing sensitive data or even taking control of critical systems.
That's terrifyingly clever. And SSHexec, is that similar to PCSEC but for Linux systems?
You got it. SSHexec lets you run commands on remote Linux systems over SSH. It's often used for administration, but it can also be abused for lateral movement. This highlights why securing remote access protocols like SSH is so crucial. Strong passwords and multi-factor authentication are your best defense.
So far, we've focused on network-based attacks.
Right.
But the source material also mentions web applications as a prime target. Are these attacks becoming more common?
Absolutely. As more and more business moves online, web applications become gold mines for attackers. The source material shows examples of exploiting vulnerabilities like default credentials in WebDAV, OpenPhishMyAdmin installations, and weak passwords that are susceptible to brute force attacks using tools like Hydra.
Okay, let's unpack those. What exactly is WebDAV and why is it a potential target?
WebDAV is a protocol for sharing files and folders over the internet. Think websites, online collaboration tools, things like that. If a WebDAV server is using default login credentials, which happens more often than you might think, an attacker can easily gain access and upload malicious files. It's like leaving your front door wide open.
And you mentioned PhpMyAdmin.
Right.
How does that fit into the picture?
PhpMyAdmin is a web-based tool for managing MySQL databases. It's incredibly useful for developers and admins, but if it's left open to the internet and using weak or default credentials, it can be a disaster. The source material shows how an attacker could exploit this to run commands on the database server, potentially stealing data or even taking control of the entire web server. It's like giving someone the keys to the kingdom.
So securing web applications is crucial, and that includes using strong, unique passwords.
Right.
What about these brute force attacks using Hydra? How do those work?
Hydra is a password cracking tool that systematically tries different password combinations until it finds the right one. It can try thousands of passwords per second, making it incredibly effective against weak passwords.
So it's like a digital battering ram pounding away at the password until it breaks through.
That's one way to think about it. This is why using strong, unique passwords for every online service is so important, and enabling multi-factor authentication whenever possible adds an extra layer of security.
So far, we've focused on exploiting specific vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
But the source material also delves into the world of network traffic analysis using a tool called Wireshark. Why is this important in the context of penetration testing?
Wireshark is like a digital eavesdropping device for network traffic. It allows you to capture and analyze packets, seeing exactly what data is being sent between systems.
Yeah.
This can be used to identify vulnerabilities, understand how systems communicate, and even potentially intercept sensitive information like login credentials if they're being sent unencrypted.
Wait, stealing login credentials? How's that possible?
If a website or service isn't using encrypted protocols like HTTPS, the data transmitted over the network is sent in plain text. Anyone sniffing the network traffic with a tool like Wireshark can potentially see this data, including usernames and passwords.
So it's like listening in on a conversation happening in plain sight.
Exactly.
Mm.
That's why using HTTPS for any website that handles sensitive information is absolutely essential.
Okay, so we've learned how to gather information, scan for open ports, exploit vulnerabilities, even capture network traffic. It's a lot to take in. Is there anything else we need to know to round out our understanding of penetration testing?
There's a whole world of specialized areas within penetration testing, but there are a few key areas highlighted in your source material that we should cover. Web application testing, wireless hacking, and exploit development are areas that are constantly evolving and pose significant challenges for security professionals.
Web application testing seems particularly relevant these days, given how much we rely on web apps for everything. What does that involve?
It's all about finding and exploiting vulnerabilities in websites and web applications. Since these apps often handle sensitive data and critical business functions, they're prime targets for attackers. The source material mentions tools like Burp Suite and SQL Map, which are essential for web app testing.
Can you give us a quick rundown of what these tools do?
Burp Suite is a powerful web proxy that lets you intercept, modify, and analyze web traffic. Think of it like a man in the middle, allowing you to see and manipulate the data being exchanged between your browser and a web server. It's invaluable for testing for vulnerabilities like SQL injection and cross-site scripting.
We've heard those terms before. Can you remind us what those vulnerabilities are and why they're so dangerous?
SQL injection is a way for attackers to inject malicious code into a website's database. Imagine a login form where an attacker enters specially crafted input that manipulates the database query, allowing them to bypass authentication or even steal data. It's like hacking a website's brain.
And cross-site scripting.
Cross-site scripting, or XSS, is when an attacker injects malicious JavaScript code into a website. This code then runs in the browser of other users who visit the site, potentially stealing their credentials, redirecting them to malicious websites, or even taking control of their computers.
Just like planting a digital trap on a website, waiting for unsuspecting users to fall into it.
Exactly. Both SQL injection and XSS are common web application vulnerabilities, and they can have serious consequences if exploited.
Okay, so web application testing is a crucial part of penetration testing. What about wireless hacking? What makes wireless networks so vulnerable?
Wireless networks can be particularly vulnerable if not properly secured. Attackers can exploit weaknesses in encryption protocols, default configurations, and even user behavior to gain access to a network. The source material mentions tools like AirCrackRead, which is a suite of tools for auditing wireless network security. It can be used to crack WP and WPA2 keys, which are used to encrypt wireless traffic, and even brute force WPS pins.
What is WPS and why is it a potential security risk?
WPS, or Wi-Fi Protected Setup, was designed to make it easier to connect devices to wireless networks, but it often relies on short, easily brute-forced pins. An attacker can use a tool like Bully, mentioned in the source material, to try different pin combinations until they gain access to the network. It's like having a simple numerical password instead of a complex one.
Okay, so securing wireless networks properly is crucial. You mentioned exploit development as another specialized area of penetration testing. What does that involve?
Exploit development is where things get really interesting and complex. It's about diving deep into software vulnerabilities and writing custom code to exploit them. The source material touches on concepts like stack-based buffer overflows, SEH overwrites, and fuzzing techniques, which are all ways to find and exploit weaknesses in software.
Those sound incredibly technical. Can you give us a basic understanding of what these concepts mean?
Sure. Imagine a program with a buffer, which is like a container for data. A stack-based buffer overflow happens when a program tries to put more data into the buffer than it can hold, causing the extra data to overflow into adjacent memory. If an attacker can control this overflow, they can potentially overwrite critical parts of the program's memory and inject their own malicious code.
So it's like overflowing a glass of water, but instead of water, it's malicious code.
That's a good analogy. SEH overwrites are another technique, targeting the structured exception handler in Windows, which is responsible for handling errors in programs. An attacker can overwrite the SEH chain to redirect program execution to their own malicious code, essentially hijacking the program's error handling mechanism.
And fuzzing, what's that all about?
Fuzzing is like throwing a bunch of random inputs at a program to see if it breaks. You're essentially trying to find unexpected behavior or crashes that might indicate vulnerabilities. It's a bit like throwing spaghetti at a wall to see what sticks, but in this case, what breaks.
Wow, exploit development sounds like a combination of deep technical knowledge and a bit of trial and error.
It is. It requires a deep understanding of how software works at a low level and the ability to think like an attacker to find creative ways to break it.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Web app testing, wireless hacking, exploit development. The source material also mentions mobile hacking as a growing concern. What makes mobile devices so vulnerable?
Mobile devices are essentially mini computers that we carry around with us everywhere, and they often have access to sensitive data like our emails, contacts, financial information, and even our location. This makes them prime targets for attackers.
And what are some of the ways attackers can exploit mobile devices?
The source material focuses primarily on Android and mentions a tool called the Smartphone Pentest Framework, or SPF, which provides a range of tools for assessing mobile security. One example is exploiting default SSH passwords on jailbroken iPhones.
Can you explain what that means?
Jailbreaking an iPhone removes the restrictions imposed by Apple, allowing users to install unauthorized apps and tweak the device's settings. However, it can also leave the device vulnerable to attacks. If the default SSH password for root access isn't changed after jailbreaking, an attacker can gain complete control over the device.
So jailbreaking is a bit of a trade-off, more control but potentially less security.
Exactly. It's important to understand the risks before jailbreaking or rooting a device, and to take steps to secure it properly afterwards.
The source material also mentions something called USSD codes, which can be used to attack mobile devices. What are those?
USSD stands for Unstructured Supplementary Service Data. They're codes you can enter on your phone to communicate with your mobile operator's network, like checking your balance or topping up your credit. However, some devices have vulnerabilities that allow attackers to trigger these codes remotely, potentially causing harm or stealing data.
So it's like sending secret commands to a phone without the user's knowledge.
Exactly. This highlights the importance of keeping your mobile devices updated with the latest security patches and being cautious about clicking on suspicious links or opening unknown files.
Another interesting technique mentioned in the source material is backdooring Android apps with a malicious agent. What does that involve?
It's a sneaky way to spread malware. Attackers take a legitimate Android app, inject malicious code into it, and then redistribute the infected app. Once a user installs the compromised app, the attacker gains access to their device. It's like a Trojan horse disguising malware as something harmless.
That's scary. So sticking to official app stores is probably a good idea.
Absolutely. Always download apps from trusted sources and pay attention to the permissions they request. If an app asks for access to things that seem unrelated to its function, that's a red flag.
The source material also talks about using mobile devices to bypass network security. How does that work?
Mobile devices often connect to both cellular networks and Wi-Fi networks, making them potential bridges between internal networks and the outside world. Attackers can exploit this to bypass perimeter security and gain access to internal networks. Imagine a compromised mobile device being used as a pivot point to infiltrate a corporate network. It's like using a back door to sneak into a building.
That makes sense. It sounds like securing mobile devices is just as important as securing any other part of a network.
Absolutely. Mobile devices are often overlooked in security strategies, but they can be a significant weak point.
This deep dive into penetration testing has been fascinating, but a bit overwhelming. It seems like there are so many different attack vectors and vulnerabilities to consider.
It can feel that way, but remember, penetration testing is about proactively identifying and addressing these weaknesses before attackers can exploit them. It's about staying ahead of the curve and building a more secure digital world.
So it's not just about breaking things, it's about understanding how to fix them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's about continuous learning and adaptation because the threat landscape is constantly evolving.
It's amazing how penetration testing has evolved alongside technology.
It really has. We've gone from focusing primarily on network-based attacks to this incredibly diverse field that encompasses web applications, wireless networks, mobile devices, and even the human element with social engineering.
And it seems like the pace of that evolution is only accelerating with things like cloud computing, the Internet of Things, and artificial intelligence. What new challenges do these emerging technologies pose for penetration testers?
Well, they introduce a whole new level of complexity. Cloud environments, for example, bring their own unique attack vectors and security considerations. You're no longer just trying to penetrate a single server. You're dealing with a vast interconnected ecosystem.
So, understanding cloud architecture and configurations becomes crucial for penetration testers.
Absolutely. And then there's the Internet of Things, with its explosion of connected devices. From smart homes to industrial control systems, this creates a massively expanded attack surface, and the consequences of a successful attack could be devastating.
It's almost overwhelming to think about the sheer number of devices that are now connected to the internet and the potential vulnerabilities they represent.
It's a real concern, and it requires a shift in how we approach security. Traditional methods often fall short in the face of these interconnected, constantly evolving systems.
And what about artificial intelligence? How does AI fit into this picture?
AI is a fascinating and powerful tool that can be used by both attackers and defenders. On the one hand, AI can enhance security by automating threat detection, responding to incidents more quickly, and even identifying vulnerabilities that humans might miss.
So AI can be a valuable ally for security professionals.
Absolutely. But there's a flip side. Attackers can also leverage AI to create more sophisticated attacks, automate social engineering campaigns, and develop malware that can learn and adapt to bypass security measures.
So it's a bit of an AI arms race with both sides trying to outsmart each other.
You could say that. It highlights the importance of continuous learning and innovation in the cybersecurity field. We need to stay ahead of the curve, always researching and developing new strategies to counter these evolving threats.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes to the complexities of penetration testing and the crucial role it plays in a comprehensive cybersecurity strategy.
I'm glad to hear that. It's a fascinating field and one that's constantly evolving.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from the fundamental concepts of penetration testing to the ethical considerations and the challenges posed by emerging technologies.
We have, and I think the key takeaway is that penetration testing is an essential part of building a more secure digital world. It's about proactively identifying and mitigating risks before they can be exploited by malicious actors.
You've given our listener a lot to think about and hopefully inspired them to learn more about this crucial field.
I hope so. Remember, knowledge is power, and in the world of cybersecurity, knowledge is our best defense.
Well, on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and remember, stay curious, keep learning, and stay safe out there in the digital world.